Thank you for joining us. My name is Juanita Palacios Sims. I'm the founder of the International Society of Black Latinos. Our mission is to bring awareness of the Afro-Latinos and also to talk about our rich and diverse culture. We also go to schools to mentor young kids, talk about our history, our culture, and help out in the community any way we can. Today's conversation will be brought by Kimberli Flores. She is a multifaceted artist committed to amplifying unrepresented voices and inspiring social change. Born and raised in New York City, Kimberli began her career as a professional mambo salsa dancer at the age of 14 years old, going on tours internationally and perform alongside numerous legendary Latin artists, including Marc Anthony, Tito Puente, El Gran Combo, and Celia Cruz. All the while, Kimberli attended Pace University in New York and received her bachelor's degree in business administration with a concentration in Latin American studies. With great passion for her community and a drive towards social activism, Kimberli went on to become a facilitator and site coordinator for the Dream Yard Action Project, a 4-year innovation arts-based community building and civic engagement project for young people living in the Bronx. Her love of the stage and the power of storytelling led her to attend the William Esper Menzner Acting Conservatory in New York City to classically train in Shakespeare at British American Drama Academy at Oxford University in the UK, and later obtained her master's degree in acting at the University of Southern California School of Dramatic Arts. Go SC. Ms. Flores is currently working as a professional actress, dancer, and writer in theater, film, and television. She has performed on stages internationally and regularly at the Old Globe Theater in San Diego. I would like to also say that she is a proud board member of the International Society of Black Latinos. I will introduce to you now Ms. Kimberli Flores.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for that introduction, Juanita. I hope everyone can hear me well. I'm just going to jump right in. So we're going to start with talking today about uncovering our Afro-Latino roots. Now, this panel is called In Conversation, and it's a roundtable discussion in which we bring together various organization leaders, authors, historians, and artists to share their personal perspectives and explore our multiracial and multicultural intersectionality in the Latino community and how this impacts identity and inclusion. So for this panel, we'll be joined by Dr. George Reed Andrews. Dr. Andrews is an American historian of Afro-Latin America and currently a distinguished professor at the University of Pittsburgh. We'll also be joined by Dr. Omaris Z. Zamora, and she's an Afro-Latinx Studies scholar and core faculty and as a professor of Africana Studies at Rutgers University. We'll also be joined by Dr. Angel Acosta. He's a healing-centered educator that teaches at Teachers College in Columbia University. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pin our participants up. Hello, Dr. Acosta.
Hey.
And Dr. Zamora, I will also pin you there. Hello, welcome. And Dr. Andrews, if you put on your camera, we can pin you. And get you up. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everyone. So today we'll be focusing on looking at the history of various Latino countries to understand our relationship to our African ancestry and how certain circumstances and events have shaped our ways of thinking and how that affects us in society today. Now, when I came up with the idea of this series, it was because at home, we weren't talking about these things. Oftentimes, it wasn't until later on in life, college, or being in various circumstances and situations that I had to actually think about identity. And it didn't come till later on when I started to see how I was affected by how I'm labeled and how I'm seen. So this is an opportunity for us to bring people like you together to explore some ideas and ask some questions. And I'm so, so thankful to have each and every one of you on here with us today. Everyone here is so, so amazing. So before we begin our question portion, I'd like to ask for each of you to briefly tell us about yourself and the perspective you'll be speaking from, your individual work, and your areas of focus. And I think I'm going to start with Dr. Andrews. So if you can unmute yourself, that would be wonderful.
I can, and I'm so happy to be here. I did a session with your group back in May. We had a terrific time talking about Black history in Latin America. That's basically what I work on. I've been teaching history at the University of Pittsburgh for 40 years. Que parece mentira, but it's actually true. And I work mainly on Black history in the region. I've lived in Argentina, I've lived in Brazil, I've lived in Uruguay, and I've traveled to most of the other countries. So I really look forward to tonight's conversation and to hearing from other people.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'll go next to Dr. Zamora.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and be on this panel. My name is Dr. Omari Zamora, and I am a professor, a scholar of Afro-Latino studies. My area in particular, I work on what, at the moment at least, my focus is on the experiences of Afro-Latina women in the United States. So really thinking about the ways that the experiences of Black Latina women or Afro-Latina women in the United States can really amplify and expand, right, how we think about women of color feminisms. And so today, I'm more of a literature and cultural studies scholar. So I think a lot about, right, how we see these things coming up in pop culture, right, in literature, right, in the things that we consume day to day, right, and really thinking about how artists, writers are telling their stories, but also, right, how can we learn from those stories, but also expand the conversation around how we think about Blackness and how we think about Latinidad, right, in a way, in an inclusive way that also tends to the experiences of Afro-Latinos in the United States in particular.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you each for telling us, for you telling us that. Now I'm going to go to Dr. Acosta.
Hey,
hello.
Welcome everybody. Bienvenidos. I consider myself a healing-centered educator, so I've dedicated the last decade to really studying and thinking through primarily leadership studies, but also anthropology, and recently finished my doctorate at Columbia, focusing on curriculum and teaching. But at the core is really thinking about the impact of structural violence and trauma on our communities, and how that relates to leadership, how that relates to teaching, how that relates to education, specifically K-8, but also broadly in terms of professional development for adults. And as an Afro-Latino myself, I have a perspective, and I have and I'm excited to be part of the discussion.
Wonderful, thank you. We're excited to have all three of you. Thank you so much for being here again. All right, so I just want to briefly say, I'm not sure if you were able to hear at the start, but if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. At the end, towards the end of the hour, we're going to open up for questions from the audience. So you can send them directly to Juanita Palacios Sims, or you can put them in the chat and we'll make sure we try and find them throughout the course of the event. There will also be a link that we're going to put in there of a survey for the event, so please fill that out. And if you have an email that you'd like to also put in the chat so we can stay in contact with you for future events, that would be wonderful. You can do that at any point throughout the hour. All right, so let's jump in. Okay, so I was really, really excited to talk about, overall, this whole panel was for me about how we can unite and move forward as a Latino community. But in order to move forward, we have to look back and we have to educate ourselves on our history. And a lot of that education didn't come from schooling. So I'm thankful that we're here and we're going to talk about issues. And I'd like to bring up some issues and then try and start with digging into the history and certain patterns and events that have happened, and then bring that forward into present day and talk about how that shows up today. Those things show up today in society and how we can heal and unite. So we'll begin. Okay, my first question is, I recently learned that in 2000, in the year 2000, in the island of Puerto Rico, 81% of the population who filled out the census identified themselves as white only. In 2016, more recently, that census number lowered slightly to 76% selecting white only. And this is specifically on the island of Puerto Rico. I'm going to share my screen and show you here. We see some of the data in 2000, and this is how the island identified. And then interestingly enough, in the US, we have the overall identification here and the percentages of how Puerto Ricans on the island identified. And when I heard about this, it was really interesting to me because I personally, being Puerto Rican, I found it interesting because when I go back to the island, what I see is a broad spectrum of brown people. I see blonde hair, blue eye Puerto Ricans, I see Black Puerto Ricans, but we're a spectrum. And so I want to ask you, Dr. Andrews, first, if you can speak to how historically we came to aligning ourselves to whiteness in the ways that we now are on the census. Can you tell us about how that's come about in Latin America from a historical perspective? And we can talk about Puerto Rico, and feel free to include any other countries that you like.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that you corrected yourself. You initially said scientifically, and then you changed it to historically.
Yes.
Because of course, these categories are not scientific. They're based on social science thinking, and they're based on cultural thinking, but they're not based on the science that used to endorse the idea of races, but now no longer does. These ideas of races and colors and what groups we belong to and so on, they have a very long history. They go way back. And in Latin America, in fact, they go all the way back to the colonial period, and they actually go back to before the colonial period to racial laws and caste laws in Spain and Portugal that were enacted in the 1400s and that divided Spanish society and Portuguese society into people of clean blood, so-called, which was not a scientific concept, it was a religious concept. And it had to do with how many generations your families had been Catholic or not. And people who had not been Catholic previously, like African people, like Roma people, like Jewish people, like Muslim people, were categorized as people of unclean blood and officially discriminated against by law. Those categories came to the colonies with the Spanish and Portuguese, and they were enforced there, but now aimed, of course, mainly at African people, at indigenous people, and at people of mixed race. And by the end of the colonial period, which for most Latin American countries is 1800, Spain and Portugal were both taking censuses of their colonial populations in which, I was about to say, they would ask people to categorize themselves. That's what we do with censuses today. We ask people how they see themselves and what category they think they fit into. At that time, the census takers made the decisions. And they would go from house to house, look at the people who were there, and then assign them to the racial categories of white, of Black, of Pardo, of racially mixed, in Puerto Rico of mulatto, and Blacks and mulattoes were then gathered together into one group in the census of de color, people of color. In 1800, Puerto Rico was about 60% white. No, actually it was just about 50% white and 50% de color. By the end of the century in 1899, that census was taken under US administration. The white population by that point was 60% of the island. That white population continued to grow in the American censuses of the first half of the 1900s. And by 1950, Puerto Rico was 80% white, which is to say that 80% of Puerto Ricans on the islands were assigning themselves to the white racial category. And of course, Kimberli says when she goes to Puerto Rico, that's not what she sees. And I would go so far as to say that when most people go to Puerto Rico, that's not what they see. That number of 80% has not come down a whole lot since then, except among Puerto Ricans who now live in the United States. And that was the point of that table that Kimberli was showing you before. Kimberli, can you throw that back up again, just to take a quick look at that?
Happy to.
Because she and I were just exchanging emails about this today. It's so interesting to see. You see that the dark green bars are Puerto Ricans who live in Puerto Rico. Those folks are very likely to classify themselves as Black. But as white.
Right.
But Puerto Ricans who live in the United States are much more likely, as compared to those on the island, to say that they are some other race, or to say that they are two or more races, right? So we then ask, why are people in the island identifying in such a different way from Puerto Ricans who live in the United States?
Right.
And I have my ideas on this. I've talked a lot. It's time for other people to think about why that might be happening.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and actually I would like to know if either Dr. Zamora or Dr. Acosta would like to talk about that aspect, the difference on the island in Puerto Rico and in the US, or just, if you like, what the alignment to whiteness may be about in your opinion. If either of you want to jump in, feel free.
I'd invite Dr. Zamora to respond to that.
I can jump into this one, and this is not something I study necessarily directly, but in terms of how we understand, right, whiteness, right, in the United States as being, right, usually we think about it as US white American, right, or in Spanish some people might say gringos, right, where the standing of Puerto Ricans in the, right, in the United States, not on the island, right, are being racialized as people of color, regardless of even if racially they may be white, right? And that's one piece of it, right? The other piece of it is that on the island, right, and this is very similar in some ways to other places in Latin America, is that we do have to think about whiteness, right? When we think about, for example, some people call them in Puerto Rico the blanquitos, right? And the blanquitos are generally identified as racially white, wealthy, middle class to upper middle class, wealthy, white racialized folks who have money, right? So these are the folks who, when they migrate to the United States, become people of color because they're not white American, right? White gringo Americans, right? So they're racialized as people of color. And that could definitely affect how people see themselves, right? Because at that point, they're not seeing themselves as the white Americans of the country, right? Whereas on the island, those folks are the white people, right? They are, many of them are, right, direct descendants of Spaniards. Many of them, right, like the Rosselló family that we all know of at this point, right, because of 2020, 2019, 2020, what was going on in the island of Puerto Rico. That family is direct descendants, right, of Spaniards, right? And so this is what we're talking about here. So I think it's important to, right, because one of the things that comes up, right, for a lot of Puerto Ricans in particular is to say, I am not white, right? So that happens a lot, right? But there's a variety of reasons why that might happen, right? But one of those things is that there is sometimes a denial of how whiteness operates within Latin America and the Caribbean, and particularly within Latinidad, right? Within the Latino community, right? And it's not to say that your whiteness is white American, right? No one's saying that necessarily, but it's to really think about the Eurocentric and European diasporic, right, ways that power, right, and whiteness are associated. So in Puerto Rico, the blanquitos might be the blanquitos. They are the white people in Puerto Rico. They hold power, right? They hold influence. And maybe the moment they come to the US, they might not hold the same kind of influence because the structures of whiteness have shifted a bit, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have some kind of privileges, right, where you're benefiting from some kind of whiteness, right? So I think that is a conversation that actually has become amplified, right, within the Latino community in the US in particular, of thinking about how do we talk about whiteness, right, as a way of understanding the privileges that come from that proximity to white supremacy, right? Or from, right, the fact that some folks can pass if they wanted to. right, in the United States, right, and the ways that that moves and the power that that has and the impact that that has. So that's just one abbreviated way, right, of thinking about whiteness and the way that whiteness moves across borders, right, in particular between Puerto Rico and the United States, that might aid us in understanding some of the numbers that you have presented to us, Kimberli.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I'm wondering, you know, what are some of the things in history that have happened? I know, for example, you know, in Dominican Republic, we had Trujillo and his reign. And maybe some people would like to know about some aspects in history from whichever perspective or whichever countries that required people or was more beneficial for people to align with whiteness. When it came time for drafting for the war, I know, so I'm Puerto Rican, so that's a lot of my background comes from, but I know that they separated soldiers based on if they could fit into the white regiments or the black regiments. And so there's definitely benefits to aligning. And if Dr. Andrews, maybe you want to jump in, or if Dr. Acosta, you have anything you want to share on this. I'm just trying to understand how we get to the point of, in 2016, in a country where, for example, in Puerto Rico, we are well aware, and there's almost a mantra on the island, from what I hear from family back home, and at least in my upbringing, of you are Taino, you are indigenous Taino, you are Black, and you are Spaniard. So maybe we can talk about how we got there in more recent history.
You know, more recent history, thinking about, you know, you mentioned Trujillo in the context of Dominican Republic. You know, Trujillo, I think he had some Haitian lineage and ancestry, but he was incredibly anti-Black, and some of the like even skin whitening practices and standards of beauty when it came to Dominican women, that still to this day, you can see it in the ways that they talk about hair, you know, and straightening hair versus curly hair. But in the Trujillo case, in the Dominican Republic in particular, you know, whiteness and white supremacy has had a very particular unfolding and manifest. And then, yeah, so I'll just say that. And then lastly, just think about Dr. Zamora's work and Dr. Reed's work, that colonization, although it did end in the period that Dr. Reed alluded to, but that coloniality, what Walter Mignolo, a Latin American scholar, calls the extension of the colonial order, transferred through the white oligarchy that remained in place. So, you know, those Blanquitos you mentioned earlier, sister, that those are the inheritors of the structure that was left in place post-colonization, and that we still suffer from in many cases.
I want to add to
Yes.
what you're saying, Dr. Acosta, because it's in that same line, right, that we can think about mestizaje or racial miscegenation, right, particularly in Latin America and parts of the Caribbean, right, thinking in Latin America, right, there's this notion of racial mixing, right, to say that we are a mixture of these races, right, but the idea of mestizaje, right, as, you know, proposed by Jose Vasconcelos, which was this Mexican philosopher of the early 1900s, right, if you contextualize, right, what is happening in the early 1900s, right, and very soon we're going to start celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month or Latino Heritage Month, right, and usually that is, right, around the same time that many Latin American countries got their independence, right, or celebrate their independence, right, and so the early 1900s, we're talking about the formation of national identities, right, in Latin America, right, which, to your point, Dr. Acosta, coloniality, right, and the genealogy, the inheritance of Spanish Empire, Portuguese Empire is handed down to the first leaders, right, of these Latin American and Caribbean countries that are thinking about what makes us, right? What makes us Colombian? What makes us Mexican, right? Right? And this is where Vasconcelos comes in, and he's talking about the cosmic race, right? And this idea that the mixture of races is what makes this kind of cosmic race, or this Latin American race, right? And thinking, and when you read, right, it sounds like, oh, that sounds like us. But when you really close read, right, he's saying it's actually a very white supremacist text that is about putting whiteness at the top and mixing in these other races, right? Blackness, indigeneity, even, and he literally says the Mongolian race, right? And these things, these features that are actually very racist, these features of these people will mix in, right? And create the cosmic race, right? And so many of my students, when they read this text, some of them have heard of Jose Vasconcelos, some of them have, right? But they've never read the cosmic race. And so when they read it closely and I ask them, well, tell me what you see, or tell me how do you interpret this text, right? They're like, this sounds a bit Aryanistic. This sounds like eugenics, right? That you're going to take the best of these races and mix it in and make this ultimate race, right? In ways that are actually rooted in white supremacy, right? And we're talking about a man who had a lot of influence and impact, right, in the creation of public school curriculums, not just in Mexico, but also in Dominican Republic, right, and in different countries in Latin America. So this is where we're starting to talk about the roots of some of these of some of this thinking of racial mixture, but it's also about mixing so much that we're mixing out the Black, we're mixing out the indigenous, right? So culturally, you may have heard the notion of bettering the race or mejorar la raza, right? This idea that if you mix with someone else, you're going to get rid of the ugly indigenous features, the ugly Black features of somebody, right? And it's a very racist, right, way of thinking, right? But these are kind of the roots of where these things lie, right? So when we're talking about racial mixture and when we're talking about Blackness and Afro-Latinidad, to reclaim, right, these identities that have had, right, a social and realistic impact in our everyday lives is about saying, we're not going to mix out the Black. We're going to say we're here. We're still here. Why? Because race is not necessarily biological. It's not about this mixing thing. Race is socially constructed and is experienced socially, right? So when you move through a space, how people react to you, how people read you, right? The kinds of experiences that you have are very central to that identity, right? But they're, right, those are just some of the things that, right, to kind of piece together, how did we get here that even some folks might think that Latino is a race, when Latino is not a race, right? So yeah.
Yes, that you know, is not a race. You brought up whitening, right? And it's the almost like system of whitening throughout history, or how did that actually come about? I don't know if Dr. Andrews, you want to jump in on that and talk about.
You all are absolutely right on it. Kimberli, you started out by talking about how you were always taught that Puerto Ricans are a mixture. They're a mixture of Taino, of Black, of European, and so on. And Dr. Zamora says that this idea of race mixture is at the heart of Latin American nationality. It does arise precisely in that period of the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. And as she says, that's a period also when people are still thinking very much in eugenic terms. They're thinking about how to produce a better kind of people, a more adaptive kind of people, a people adapted to their environment and to their historical antecedents. And it is still a period in which scientific racist thinking, which had been absolutely hegemonic in the Western world from the last quarter of the 1800s through the first quarter of the 1900s, is still very, very powerful in scientific thought. These people, the folks who are promoting the idea of race mixture, like Vasconcelos, like Gilberto Freire in Brazil, like Fernando Ortiz in Cuba, and other thinkers, they are wrestling with scientific racism. They're trying to get out from under it, but they can't completely escape from it. They're still thinking in racial terms taken from scientific racism, but they're trying to rework the formula so that non-white racial heritage is not an automatic condemnation to second or third rate status for Latin American nations. And so they come up with this idea, which for the time, I would argue is really quite progressive, of rather than trying to whiten through European immigration or by imitating European cultural norms, let's accept who we are. Let's acknowledge the fact that we are powerfully based on indigenous civilizations. We're powerfully affected by African cultural contributions, and of course by European. Let's acknowledge that we've put those all together to create something completely new in world history. that cosmic race, or different kinds of terms for it in other countries, and form societies in which everyone can participate on terms of relative equality. And of course, that's the great catch, because after living first with colonial racism and then with scientific racism for 300 to 400 years, you don't just walk away from that.
Can I jump in and ask you real quick? Can you just explain briefly scientific racism?
Oh, scientific racism, sure, absolutely. And you know what? I know that I have to explain that. Whenever it comes up in my courses, and I ask my students, how many of you have heard of scientific racism? About half will say yes, and half will say no. They have not heard of it, despite the fact that it was the hegemonic science of the early 1900s. And scientific racism, very briefly, is the idea that all of humanity can be, and is in fact scientifically, divided into distinct racial groups: white race, Black race, Asian race, American indigenous, and so on. That whatever you are as an individual and whatever you are as a nation is determined by your racial heritage. And those races are not equal in the concept of scientific racism. They are arranged in a racial hierarchy with whiteness at the top, and then the scientific races will disagree about how the races sort themselves out underneath that, but whiteness on top, without question. And of course, this thinking is at the root of the foundation of anthropology in the late 1800s. It's at the root of the foundation of academic history, of psychology, of sociology, and it's going to take decades for those disciplines to try to come back from that historical foundation, from that historical root. And what's even worse about scientific racism is that people had been racist in the Western world, and indeed probably the whole world, for hundreds of years. But they had been racist in a kind of common sense, everyday sort of way, not really thinking a whole lot about it, just knowing that, of course, white people are better than Black people and indigenous people and so on. But now that kind of thinking has formal scientific validity. You remember the science of measuring skulls? That's one way you determine which races are better than other races, by the formation of your skull, by the size of your skull. And of course, white people have the best skulls, followed by other racial groups, which have kind of second and third rate skulls. That kind of thinking now has a scientific basis that is going to take decades to undermine and overcome. And in fact, well, in some ways, we're still struggling with the residue of that thinking. But it's really powerful in the early 1900s. It says all Latin American nations are doomed because none of them are majority white, except for Argentina and Uruguay, which do get there by bringing European immigrants. All the rest, forget about it, hopeless. The thinkers who are thinking about race mixture as the foundation of Latin American nationality are trying to come back and overcome the negative effects of that thinking. And folks, hey, it actually worked, because Kimberli, how were you taught to think about Puerto Rico? It's the product of race mixture. People in Brazil, how do they think about being Brazilian? The essence of Brazilian is being racially mixed, being culturally mixed, et cetera, and every Latin American nation has its variant of this kind of thinking, mestizaje thinking. But how does it square with the actual conditions of lived daily life? You know, when you go to a restaurant, when you try to go to the university, when you try to enroll your child in school, when you try to buy an apartment in a given neighborhood and so on, how does that line up with the concept of all of us being equal? Hey, folks, and that's why the census is so great, because it gives us the data on what's actually happening to people of different racial groups when they go out in the world and try to pursue those opportunities. What kind of jobs do they end up working? How much money on average do they end up making? What levels of education do they achieve? How long do they live? The most basic indicator of human welfare. And we know the story, right? And it's in the census of all the Latin American countries. Tremendous racial inequalities. tremendous, as bad as the United States, quite as bad, in some cases worse. Anyway, don't get me started on the census. I'm a huge fan.
Well, there's so much good that comes out of what you're saying. Is it brings so many thoughts to my mind. And one is you mentioned how there are kind of residual subconscious ways of seeing and viewing people of color, and how that permeates and continues to permeate in society. And I want to ask Dr. Acosta about that, because we're hearing about scientific racism, which to us sounds outlandish, right? And then we can talk about one-drop rules and ideas in Latin America versus the one-drop rule here, of African Americans. And there's just so many concepts and things that have happened over the years that we think we're past. And I ask you, are we past a lot of that thinking? How does it show up today? And if you have any examples of other aspects of history that show up today in different industries or in different areas, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. The lingering effects. Oh, you're muted.
No, just appreciating the conversation so far, and just recognizing the depth of that has been laid, and we can keep going so deep.
Many areas.
I want to slow us down a little bit, in the sense that what Dr. Reed is sharing and what Dr. Aurora is sharing is so much, right? We're literally talking about almost 500 years plus of intellectual, social, and emotional baggage. And we can stay in this very intellectual place, and I can have a field day talking to all of you conceptually about these concepts, but to slow us down and to feel into this orientation that experience can produce, and that's, I think, my first response to you is that trauma, the collective trauma of those experiences are still with us today, and it's coming up in this conversation here as we talk about whiteness and the impact of whiteness on all of us, even those of us who may benefit from it in the Latin American context. So yeah, the impact of colonization, of slavery, of the encomienda systems that were the enslavement and the eradication and the murder of indigenous people in Latin America. I mean, the lost decade and the awkward and dysfunctional relationship with U.S. foreign policy and the ways that Latin America suffered. And so there's just a lot that, yes, we're still being impacted by. And then I'll say two more things just to honor Dr. Reed as far as scientific racism. One thing to also name is that the Enlightenment also had an impact on how we developed culturally, and how whiteness is formed, and how the very nature of what the human category is constituted by, that the white man will become the apex and the definition of the human, or the human with most power, especially land owning and land holding. So scientific racism, the Enlightenment, the kind of empiricism, scientific empiricism that evolves out of that, some great contributions in terms of science, don't get me wrong, brilliant, but socially, it gave us the opportunity to navigate and to administer a transatlantic slave trade that ran for several hundred years without a moral accountability. So I think what's happening now is that more of us have the language to talk about this, and I'm just grateful to be here. And it shows up again in this conversation around whiteness, that whiteness takes up so much space. So that's what I'll say.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like, I'll speak to this. I know that there was, in my reading your book, Dr. Andrews, Afro-Latin America, 1800 to 2000. I highly suggest it for everyone on here. It's a wealth of information, and I'm really, really enjoying it. I'm gonna share an excerpt from one of your pages, and it'll lead me to the next question that build onto something that Dr. Acosta just said. So I pulled from on page 15, you talk about as far back as in the 1700s in Brazil, Argentina, and Peru right now. You mentioned that there were food processing establishments such as bakeries or the meat, salting, and drying factories of southern Brazil and Argentina. They made heavy use of slave labor, so much so that in Lima, Peru, and other cities, slaves convicted of crimes were sent to work off their sentences in local bakeries. And when I read that, I thought, well, that sounds like the prison industrial complex today. And I remember watching the documentary 13th, I believe, by Ava DuVernay on Netflix. And I was shocked to hear how many major companies in the US use prison labor to make their products, free prison labor. And I thought, this is something that's been dating back since the 1700s. So then I made the connection that this is how, I guess my question is to any of you, how have these systems, one, you can talk about how they came about, but how do they play a role in our capitalistic society? How does systematic oppression play an essential role in a capitalistic society and further encourage racism and segregation within our communities? Anyone can jump in, whoever would like to. Would you like to speak to it, Dr. Zamora?
Speak to it to a certain extent, because I think I think one of the main things, it's different pieces here, right? Because I think one piece of it is thinking about the prison industrial complex, right? But also overall as an umbrella, thinking about systemic and institutionalized oppression, right? Which the prison industrial complex is part of that. And I also want to speak specifically to the experiences or to about Black Latinos or Afro-Latinos, right, and their experiences or our experiences, because there is a sense that, right, within the United States, the experiences of Afro-Latinos, the reality is that the experiences of Afro-Latinos are marginalized when it comes to conversations about systemic racism or institutionalized racism, because people don't generally know much about Afro-Latinos, right? The general audience is just now starting to learn about who Afro-Latinos are or who Black Latinos are, right? And where we play in the conversation, right? As Black people, right? So the interesting thing is that, for example, when I see numbers of the racial makeup of folks who are incarcerated, right, or have been in prison or formerly imprisoned, and you see Black and Latino and then white, I always ask, okay, from those Black people, how many are Black Latinos? Or from those Latinos, how many are they Afro-Latinos or Black Latinos, right? The numbers don't always tell us the full story about where our folks are in that system, because we know they're there, right? And I say that specifically, right, in my own personal experience. My father, who's a Black Dominican man, was incarcerated for 20 years, right? And the ways that race operates in the systems of incarceration, right, vary a lot, right? How someone who is incarcerated moves within the prison is one way, but also thinking of the families and the folks who are on the outside and their experiences with the prison industrial complex that are also very racialized, right? So I kind of put that on the table because it is very complex, right? To think about where can we understand the experiences of Afro-Latinos in these kinds of institutional systemic webs of anti-Blackness, right, and anti-Black racism, right? And the reality is that Afro-Latinos, Black Latinos are experiencing similar experiences to your average Black American person or other Black person, right? That may not necessarily identify as Black Latino, right, or Afro-Latino, right? But the numbers and the data doesn't always give us that information, right? Because, right, mainstream media sees Black Lives Matter or the prison industrial complex, and it's only thought of as a Black American or African American framework, right? Or when they're talking about the concept of immigration, right? it's framed as predominantly Mexican or Central American non-Black issue, right? When we do know that Afro-Latinos or Afro-Latin American folks are at the intersections of both of these things, right? But we're left out of the conversation, right? And so one of the interesting things that I was talking about with my partner earlier, I had the question of like, you know, when it comes to capitalism, right, and the money-making machine, right, the reality is that there is, and this is just me thinking, right, this is literally me thinking this morning as I'm having my coffee, sitting on the front porch with my partner, and we're like, how are we gonna get the general audience, right, we're just thinking generally, how are we gonna get white Americans to see Afro-Latinos, right? And then we have to think, okay, well, how is it that, you know, the Black American population, how is it that white Americans have seen Black American stories to the point that there is, the media reports on this stuff, right? There are stories that reflect these experiences, right? Same with the Latino story, right? Which is seen as predominantly Mexican or Central American, right? How is it that they see those stories? And we ask these questions and I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, unfortunately, there's something capitalistic and neoliberal about white guilt and white shame, right? The ways that white Americans, the white American general audience, right? How do they buy into these things? How do they capitalize and monopolize affective things that people want to see or that people are willing to give space to, right? And there's something there. Of course, there's more layers to it, but we were just thinking like generally, how do we make it so that Afro-Latinos and the experiences of Afro-Latinos in the prison industrial complex, in experiences of immigration or undocumented immigration are at the table, so that our issues are at the table, right? And the reality is that there is capitalism and neoliberal, right, things that are attached to that, right? And that's a question that I still have, right? Of like, well, how is it that we make people see? And sometimes the unfortunate answer that I came to this morning, which is by no means backed up by any kind of scholarly thing, but I'm just sitting there ruminating, is like, so Afro-Latinos need to make white Americans feel bad so that they actually see us? I'm like, they're not gonna see us. Because they're gonna say that's a Latino issue. They're like, oh, that's those people's issues being, anti-Black racist against those people. That's not my issue. And it's like, no, that's a collective issue, right? How do we actually bring this to the forefront? So it's one of those things that I'm still thinking about, that I'm still grappling with, of how do we understand the ways that systemic and institutionalized racism, right, as tied to the prison industrial complex, as tied to folks who are moving through the educational system and pipelines, are experiencing that, because they are, right? Like I've experienced it, right, where it's like there can be I'm trying to think of like just different ways of thinking about, for example, funding projects like mine, right? So like, if I apply for a grant to fund my project about Afro-Latina women, but people don't know how to even, they're like, what is that? Who is that? Why is that even important, right? I have to do a lot of the extra legwork, right, that other folks may not have to do. And because someone may not understand it or see it or value it, it doesn't get funded, right? So that's the way that then if something doesn't get funded, then other people devalue the project as well and see it, oh, well, that's not valuable because it's not funded. If it's not funded, that's not my problem, right? So there's ways in which systems disinvest, right, in our experiences because they're not legible to them, right? So I think that's one of the issues that I struggle with to think through all the time, right? How do I get people to understand that this is important?
Yes, that's awesome. Yeah. And actually, I want to jump into questions, but I just want to ask Dr. Acosta, as a healing-centered educator, if you could just throw out some things that could help us heal, or some things that I do believe education is part of it, but do you, and what is most important for us moving forward in healing?
Yeah, I'll share a little bit. That's a big question. One thing is there's conversations like this, right? Conversations like this that begin to name some of the things that are happening. So when any kind of truth and reconciliation process, oftentimes there are multiple steps, but when it comes to the healing-centered paradigm, one of them is just recognizing what's happening, especially if it comes to like trauma or harm, recognizing that their harm has been done, and then an intention to repair, and then an attempt to repair, so part of more conversations like this, one, I want to raise this because I think it's a provocative point in Afro Latin or Latina or Latino or Latino, however you want, whatever concept you feel best framing that as. But I think the Afro religious influence and cosmological influence in our culture, I think is interesting because the tensions between that and Christianity and whiteness are fascinating. Because at the same time, we're in a moment where a lot of us are reclaiming our Afro and our indigenous roots, yet the practices that originate from those communities contradict the powerful Christian, Judeo-Christian cultural values that are so held strongly in our communities. So just as a point of healing, I think that's a place to do some serious work, like across religious conversations around that in Latin America, and as it pertains to Afro-Latinos in particular. So just kind of really having more conversations around the pain that we carry as a community. Two, breaking the stigma around mental health, even in our, in terms of like when people have difficulty, we don't talk about it. There's a lot of stigma around like how we show up and talk about depression, and because I think I see that a lot in unfolding. And then doing your own personal work, are you trying to become a little bit more grounded and centered and restored in the face of constant suffering? And then lastly, hope. I think times are rough, right when we're having this conversation around Afro-Latinidad, and there's also legislation trying to ban critical race theory and conversations around race. Fascinating, right? In terms of, so it's a lot. It's a lot to hold, but I'm excited that, we had this conversation.
Yes, as I feel like each one of you can do, I can have a 2-hour panel with each of you because there's so many layers. So I appreciate each of you going in and giving snippets. And it's just a taste. And I hope that this encourages people to look into and research some of the things that you're speaking about. I'm going to jump into some questions. So we have some questions here that were posed, and they're really great. This first one is by, just so I can make sure I give them, Trisha. Okay, she's asking, how does the history of almost 800 years of the occupation by the Moors of the Iberian Peninsula, Moors being predominantly of African, AKA Black origin, affect the anti-Blackness throughout the entire Spanish and Portuguese empires? Also, there is incredible racism in Italy and Greece as well, overall. I have my own thoughts and theories, but curious to hear the scholar's point of view. Do you want to jump in, Dr. Andrews?
Not really, but
no, we're asking big questions today.
Because the questions are so big and the conversation has been so big. It's really, I'm following Dr. Acosta's suggestion that we slow down and think about this some more. And I am slowing down and I am thinking about it some more. Anyway, the Arab invasions and occupations of Iberia, major, because indeed, Islamic kingdoms rule Spain and Portugal for between 500 and 700 years. And both of those nations engage in a long-term crusade. They don't have to go to the Holy Land to fight their crusade. They're fighting their crusades against Islam on their own soils. So when they finally defeat the last Islamic kingdoms, and indeed even before they defeat those kingdoms in the late 1400s, they are putting into effect those laws and those ways of thinking about race that I mentioned at the very beginning of the session. The caste laws, the laws that divide people into unclean and clean. And those laws may, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that those are the first cases of formal racist law in the Western world. The caste laws in Spain and Portugal, and the Latin American empires come right out of that experience. So the impact is direct and major. And that may be it for that question.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, I am going to jump to another question that we have here that kind of brings things to a little bit more present day, by Melissa Shepard Williams. She's one of our board members. And she asks, what are your thoughts about earlier generations' resistance to the term Latinx? What are your thoughts about earlier generations' resistance? And by that, I assume she may mean the older generations' resistance to the term Latinx. Do you maybe want to talk about that, Dr. Zamora?
Sure. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that, Melissa.
I just want to mention, since I want to keep everyone pretty much close to time, we may go over a few minutes, if that's okay. So we'll just briefly jump in and try and capture whatever we can in a minute or two.
So for folks who don't know, generally the term Latinx came up as a term to refer to Latinos inclusively, right? Latinos, because generally we say Latinos, right? And Latinos, the masculine for the plural, right? In Spanish, so we say Latinos. So folks who may identify as non-binary gendered folks came up, with the word Latinx, right? As a way of saying this will include everyone of all genders, right? As a way of being gender inclusive. So that's how the term Latinx came about. Some folks who are of older generations, there are many different, I wouldn't even say elder generations, there are people in my generation who also don't really necessarily like the term, right? And there are different arguments and different claims that have been said. Some folks, don't like it because they feel that it is killing the Spanish language, right? And it's different, that's not grammatically correct, and they want to stick to what the language is supposed to be masculine for plural, and that's what it is, and they want to leave it at that. Some folks don't like it because they feel that Latinos, Latinas, arroba is already inclusive, right? And don't really want to expand their ways of thinking about gender. The reality is that some folks, whether they're the folks who want to stick to Latinx because they don't want to damage the Spanish language, that's very obviously holding on to a colonial language, right? And it's well, we all know that Latinos in the United States have come up with a lot of words, Spanglish words that we've come up with, and clearly some people are okay with those, right? But you don't want to be okay with Latinx. And some folks, don't like Latinx because they don't think, our communities are very conservative and they don't want to think about gender inclusivity, nor do they want to do that, right? Unfortunately, some folks have started to use Latinx as a way that also flattens and actually leaves out folks from that don't identify with, the gender binary, as a way of saying, well, if we're all Latinx, then we're all here, right? And I can, so one of the ways that I use it personally is that when I use Latinx, I'm referring to non-binary gendered folks, right? I think Latinx can be inclusive, but I think that the intention and the purpose of the term can lose, right? It's the reason why it came to be. So when I try to, say everyone, I say Latino, Latina, Latinx, right? To refer to everyone in that way. But yeah, so my thoughts is that I think folks are just resistant to change, and that isn't necessarily going to move us forward.
Interesting. Yes. Thank you for that. Okay, well, I have another question that's kind of, it goes off of a bit of what we were talking about earlier in terms of mejorar la raza, the term mejorar la raza. And Juanita mentioned, I think the question is from Juanita, I'm not too sure, maybe she copied it for me, but can you talk about self-hatred? And, it mentions, I lived in Mexico. I often heard the comment mejorar la raza with regards to marrying in order to be sure to have lighter skinned children. How do we move towards self-love? We kind of touched on this, but if anyone else or if anyone would like to jump on.
You already see a lot of movement in the next generation with that. Like I know my colleague, like Ms. Rizos from the Dominican Republic, and then the many other Afro-Latinas who have really reconnected with their ancestry by just having their hair naturally Afro. And even that, like I think there is evidence that there's some good signs of healthy conceptions of self in our community. And then, but I think the question around like the older generation responding to whether it's Latinx or any kind of cultural evolution, I think part of what needs to happen is just better communication. It's generationally. Like if I went to my grandma right now and I said, "Mama, what do you think about Latinx?" You'd be like, "¿Qué es eso?" She'd be like, you know. So there's so much around like language and culture change and translation and intergenerational dialogue that I think it's important to move the discussion forward.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think what's so interesting with this conversation is like, in some ways we've moved forward, of course, and in other ways we're really where I feel like in the Latino community there's still such a divide. There's an internal divide, and I think a part of it is because we are different culturally, you know, being Puerto Rican and being Dominican and being Mexican and being Argentinian. There's quite a lot of differences, but there's also so many, you know, similarities. So how do we move together collectively, and how can we do that by also honoring our individuality? Yeah, I'll leave it at that. What any thoughts on that? Or is that necessary?
That's a big one.
No, they're all really big questions.
I mean, I can say this. I think that what you were saying, Dr. Acosta, is right? Like there has to be dialogue, right? I think one of the first things is knowing the history is one, right? And educating yourself. Then having dialogue, right? Intergenerational, in your community, in your family. Family's a big one. Family's where I do a lot of heavy lifting that's unpaid, right? Where, you know, I have conversations with my parents about Latinx, which then goes to really a conversation about, let's talk about how you think about gender. Let's talk about how you think about, you know, and those kinds of things. But I think it's about conversation, but it's also a lot about listening, right? Because you got a lot of folks that don't want to listen. They're like, this is what it is, and that's what it is, and I don't want to hear it, right? That's just what it is. Y'all are coming up with these new things. That's not it, right? So I think it's also about listening. It's also about holding each other accountable, right? Some people do call outs. Some people prefer to do call ins. Let me call you in and holler at you. And it's also about having anti-racist practices, right? It's not just about knowing what you know, but also doing the thing that's going to move us forward, right? And that's not necessarily always easy, but it is necessary, right, for us to move together collectively. I believe that we can, but we first need to have some of those uncomfortable conversations, get to know each other, educate each other, right? And being able to, right, I hope that in some instances we can move, you know, together collectively, but it requires a lot of compromise and a lot of sacrifice and a lot of anti-racist practices that people have to commit to.
Right. And so what I'm hearing you saying is, you know, we can't just say, I support you. We have to show up in ways that are actually supporting and promoting equality. And, you know, we're a culture where we are on Instagram a lot and we're on social media a lot and we say a lot, but in the times and the opportunities for us to speak up and make decisions that will promote equality, that's when we really we make a difference, is what I'm hearing you say, which is an awesome point. I'm gonna just take one last question, if that's okay, if y'all don't mind, because Alexis Soto put a question up that really speaks to my heart and is kind of the reason why this whole panel came about for me. So Alexis says, as an Afro-Latino, I've grown up in the US with mostly negative reactions from African Americans. They've often say that I wasn't Black or other races would say that I'm not Black enough. It seems as though I'm too much or too little in everyone's eyes here in the US. Can you give some thoughts on this? I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling this way. And I personally have found myself struggling with wanting to be in support of acknowledging my Blackness, and have friends who say, you know, you should just identify as Black. And then I have friends in the Black community that may feel like you absolutely should not just identify as Black because you have a different lived experience from me. So what are your thoughts on that? If anybody, you know, wants to jump in from any perspective, from any angle, I'm open to anything you'd like to share for this last question.
And I'll just say that we're obsessed with our identities, and it's fascinating that, you know, and especially in the U.S., you know, we were thinking of being post-racial at some point. But yeah, I just think that this is going to be the norm, and that will be the case for those of us who hold intersectional identities. Like, I'm always going to have to battle how much I'm accepted in certain communities, whether I'm Black enough, whether I'm not, whether I'm Latino enough. You know, for example, even as a person of color who was raised in New York City, like, my Spanish isn't all that on point, to be honest. So when I'm in Latin American Spanish context, I feel insecure linguistically. So it's just fast. So I think we just got to get used to and build what my colleague calls discomfort resilience, of really sitting with the discomfort of what it means to navigate complicated identities, and also try to be safe, right? You know, remain, you know, keep, because I know it's difficult in many cases, and also push, you know, have provocative conversations when you can without putting yourself in harm's way, verbally or physically, because it's real out here. But yeah, you know, I think, and again, having more conversations like this that are rich.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I will wrap this up now and say that, my goodness, this has been so insightful. I feel like each and every one of you gave answers that we could have peeled back for hours. So thank you for giving us a taste of all these things, allowing us to start getting our minds moving and starting to question things and look into things. And I hope this encourages everyone who's watching to start digging in, follow all of these professors here, look into their work. They're each doing some amazing, amazing things. So I thank each of you for your time tonight, for sharing your expertise and being with us. Thank you so, so much. And I will wrap this up by saying to everyone, thank you. Thank you for coming. We will be having our next panel on Thursday, September 2nd. Same time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll have Dr. Sheila Walker and Yvette Modestine, and we'll be digging deeper into history and our culture. And thank you all for being here. I'll also have Dr. Juanita Palacios Sims jump on for a quick second to just tell us a little bit about ISBL and next steps if you'd like to be in contact with us.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you to all our distinguished guests, Dr. Acosta, Dr. Andrews, and Dr. Zamora. We at the International Society of Black Latinos, this is what we've been doing for 10.5 years, trying to educate our communities about the existence of the Afro-Latino, the Black Latino, whichever one, Latinx. And we go around the schools and educate kids about the works that Afro-Latinos have been doing for so many years. Please take a look at the chat, everyone. I put the names of the books that Dr. Andrews has written. There's quite a few. Again, thank you for joining us. And as Kimberly said, we will chat again in Conversation, series number 3 on September 2nd. Thank you, East Coast and West Coast. Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you really soon. Thank you, thank you, thank you.